The flashing red and blue lights reflected against the glossy surface of the black sedan, creating an eerie glow in the dimming evening light. Dana Williams tightened her grip on the steering wheel for a moment before exhaling slowly. She had done nothing wrong. Yet, she knew this interaction was about to be anything but routine. The city of Sacramento stretched behind her, its skyline painted in shades of purple and deep orange, the last remnants of daylight fading into night. The streets, alive with the hum of rush hour, were beginning to quiet as people made their way home. Dana had been doing the same, eager to unwind after a long day of meetings, reports, and decisions that carried weight far beyond the office walls. But now, she sat in her car, watching in the rearview mirror as the officer emerged from his vehicle with a slow, deliberate stride. His uniform was crisp, his movements rehearsed, confident, almost exaggerated. A man used to commanding authority. A man who expected obedience without question. Dana's window was already down when he reached her door. The cool air of the evening carried the tension between them. His gaze was piercing, filled with something she recognized all too well. Not professionalism. Not concern for a potential traffic violation. Something else. Something more insidious. License and registration, he demanded, his voice devoid of greeting, explanation, or even the basic courtesy one might extend to a stranger. Dana met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, an old tactic meant to unnerve. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped. "We'll discuss that after you hand over your documents." With measured movements, Dana retrieved her license and registration from the glove compartment. She kept her motions slow, deliberate, ensuring there was no room for misinterpretation. She had seen too many stories, heard too many names, to take any risks. The officer snatched the documents from her hand, barely glancing at them before shifting his focus back to her. The pause was intentional. The scrutiny was calculated. And then, finally, he spoke. "You ran a yellow light." Dana arched an eyebrow, keeping her voice steady. "I came to a full stop when it turned red." The corner of his mouth twitched in something resembling amusement, but there was no warmth behind it. "That's not how I saw it." Another pause. Another opportunity for her to react. She didn't give him the satisfaction. "Are you from around here?" he asked abruptly, his tone laced with something unspoken. Dana didn't blink. "My address is on my license." He barely glanced at the card in his hand. "An address is one thing. But you don't look like the people I usually see around here." There it was. Unspoken, but loud enough to reverberate through the night air. Dana felt a familiar fire ignite in her chest, but she kept her expression calm, her voice even. "I wasn't aware certain people belonged in specific areas, officer." His smirk returned, this time more pronounced. "Just making conversation." Dana wasn't fooled. This was more than conversation. This was an assessment, a challenge, a game of power dressed up as procedure. "And where exactly do you work?" he continued, shifting the conversation further away from any legitimate traffic concern. Dana tilted her head slightly, her patience beginning to thin. "That doesn't seem relevant to this stop." The smirk disappeared. "Sometimes, I like to get to know who I'm dealing with." Another pause. Another silent battle of wills. Dana had encountered men like him before. Men who thrived on intimidation, who believed their uniform granted them unchecked power. Men who saw people, like her, not as individuals, but as intrusions into spaces they believed were theirs to control. Still, she held firm. "I believe you have everything you need, officer. Unless there's something else." His jaw tightened. Then, as if making a decision, he straightened to his full height. "Step out of the car." Dana's grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly. She knew this moment was critical. One wrong move, one perceived act of defiance, and this could spiral. "Officer," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "Can you explain the reason for this request? I've fully complied and have not committed any violations." His eyes narrowed, his posture shifting slightly as if preparing for resistance. "Are you refusing to follow a lawful police order?" A threat. Thinly veiled, but a threat nonetheless. Dana remained composed. "I'm simply asking for clarification." The air between them was thick, electric with unspoken tension. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the officer leaned in just slightly. "I don't have to explain everything to you," he said, his voice lower, heavier. "Step out of the car." Dana took a slow breath, steadying herself. She knew her rights. She knew her power. And most importantly, she knew exactly who she was. What Officer Patrick Mitchell didn't know, however, was that he had just pulled over the Chief of Internal Affairs, the very person who had the power to determine the fate of officers like him. Dana recognized that defiance could easily escalate the situation. With deliberate movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt, pushed open the car door, and stepped out. The crisp evening air pressed against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the weight of Patrick's stare. His eyes scanned her, dissecting every detail from her sleek, tailored suit to the polished black heels that clicked against the pavement. His expression flickered, briefly unsettled, before he hardened his posture, stepping back and crossing his arms. "Place your hands on the hood," he commanded, his voice void of uncertainty. Dana met his gaze directly, unblinking, composed but unyielding. "Officer, could you clarify what exactly I'm being suspected of?" Her voice was steady, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Patrick let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Standard procedure," he replied, the words drenched in mockery. "You never know what someone might be carrying. Better safe than sorry." Choosing silence over rebuttal, Dana turned toward her car and placed her hands against the cool metal hood. Her stance was straight, unaffected. Behind her, Patrick approached with measured steps, his boots echoing in the strained quiet. His search began, methodical, but unnecessarily slow. Dana exhaled quietly. "You seem to be taking your time, officer." Patrick didn't respond immediately. Instead, he finished his inspection with a subtle frown, his fingers twitching in restrained frustration. "You're clean," he muttered, as if that outcome disappointed him. Dana turned, facing him fully. "I've complied with everything you asked. Now, can you explain the real reason behind this stop?" For a moment, Patrick didn't speak. His expression was unreadable, but the way his jaw tensed gave away his inner calculations. Instead of answering, he shrugged, eyes locking onto hers with an assessing glint. "You seem awfully familiar with this process," he noted. "This isn't your first time, is it?" Dana didn't flinch. She recognized the shift. This was no longer a routine stop. This was about power. Control. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself before responding. "Do you often stop women in suits driving cars like mine?" Patrick's smirk was back, but thinner this time, forced. "You should be careful with your tone," he warned. "I'm just doing my job. You wouldn't want to make things more difficult, would you?" A flicker of amusement crossed Dana's face, barely there, but enough to be noticed. "I've fully cooperated, officer. But if you're searching for a reason, perhaps you should be more upfront about it." Patrick's grip on his belt tightened. "Are you suggesting I'm deliberately giving you a hard time?" Dana tilted her head slightly. "I didn't say that," she replied smoothly. "I just find it interesting how much time you're spending asking questions unrelated to any traffic infraction." Patrick's body stiffened. His eyes darted slightly, scanning the street as if seeking an external justification for his actions. "You seem very familiar with how things work," he finally said. "What do you do for a living?" Dana's lips curved into a knowing smile, devoid of warmth. "I work in a field where transparency and accountability are critical." Patrick's expression soured. His irritation was tangible now, seeping into the air between them. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "Confidence can be misinterpreted, you know," he said, his voice dropping to a near growl. "People think it'll get them out of trouble, but sometimes it just makes things worse." Dana remained still, her gaze unwavering. "And what would be the correct attitude for someone in my position?" Patrick opened his mouth but faltered, words failing him for a beat too long. The dynamic was shifting, and he could feel it. He was supposed to have the upper hand, but somehow, she had flipped the script. After another pause, he scoffed. "You should remember, I'm the one in charge here." Dana nodded slightly, considering his words. Then, with perfect control, she responded. "That's true, officer. You are in charge of your actions. Just as I am in charge of how I respond to them." Patrick exhaled sharply, his irritation slipping into something closer to discomfort. He took a step back, regaining a fraction of distance, as if suddenly unsure of how to proceed. His fingers tapped against his belt, his jaw flexing. "This stop is over," he finally muttered, stepping away. "You're free to go." Dana studied him for a lingering second before nodding. Without another word, She turned, smoothed out her suit, and stepped back into her car. The door shut with a soft click, and as she adjusted her mirror, she saw Patrick still standing there, watching, but saying nothing. She shifted the car into gear, rolled forward slowly, and merged onto the road. The tension still clung to her like a second skin, but she didn't let it linger. She had stood her ground, and that was enough. For now. Dana didn't flinch, nor did she blink. Her posture remained steady, her expression unreadable. She could see the battle playing out in Patrick's mind, the tension coiling tight within him as he wrestled with the realization that this encounter was slipping beyond his control. Then perhaps we should return to the matter at hand, she replied, her tone smooth as polished glass. I pulled over as instructed. I've complied. I've answered all your questions. So what's next, officer? Patrick's discomfort became evident. The usual script of intimidation, the well-worn routine of pressing until submission, wasn't playing out as expected. Dana wasn't stammering apologies or offering meek obedience. She was standing firm, unwavering, and worst of all, she was making him justify himself. He had no valid reason to prolong the encounter, yet walking away felt like conceding defeat. People like you, Patrick suddenly said, his voice laced with irritation, his composure fraying. Always think you can get away with anything. The words landed like a slap. He hadn't shouted, but the malice in his voice crackled in. The air between them. Dana straightened. Her gaze, sharp and unyielding, locked onto his. People like me, she echoed, drawing out each word with deliberate precision. Patrick flinched slightly, realizing his misstep, but rather than backtrack, he stiffened, doubling down. I mean people who think the rules don't apply to them. Dana let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, shaking her head slightly. Let me be clear, officer. I follow the rules. I know my rights. And I also know that what's happening here has nothing to do with a minor traffic violation anymore. Patrick's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers flexed at his sides, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his authority. But the more he spoke, the more his power eroded. Listen, he said, his voice lower now, an attempt at controlled menace. If you want to get this over with quickly, you'll keep quiet and do as I say. Dana crossed her arms. Her eyes never wavered. Officer, we both know that's not how this works, she said, her voice carrying an icy edge. And I won't stay quiet while you handle this in a way that goes beyond what's lawful. Patrick's fists clenched. He knew he'd pushed too far, said too much. He was standing before someone who wasn't easily rattled, someone who saw right through him. And that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Dana wasn't just another citizen to intimidate, she was a mirror, reflecting every dark corner of his bias and aggression. Dana tilted her head slightly, considering him. Then, with a calm precision that sent a ripple of unease through Patrick, she repeated his words back to him. People like me. Patrick's breath hitched. It was as though she had flipped the scene, turning his own script against him. He tried to straighten, to pull himself back into the comfort of authority, but something about Dana's presence made it difficult. That's not what I meant, he muttered, but even to his own ears, it sounded weak. Dana's eyes remained locked onto his. Then what did you mean, Officer Mitchell? She asked, her voice even, yet carrying the weight of an interrogation. Patrick hesitated. He could feel himself slipping, like a man gripping a ledge with nothing solid to hold onto. I just meant that, a lot of people think they can avoid responsibility. And you, well, you seem like one of them. Dana exhaled sharply, a breath that was almost a laugh but devoid of any amusement. I seem like that, she echoed. And what exactly gives you that impression, officer? My skin color, the suit I'm wearing, or the fact that I refuse to be intimidated? Patrick's hand tightened around his belt. His face was rigid, his jaw working as he searched for a retort, but the words wouldn't come. Dana could see the battle within him, the frustration, the shame, the unspoken rage. I don't have to answer your questions, he finally said, voice rough with barely restrained anger. I'm just doing my job. And I won't let you turn this into something it's not. Dana took a slow step forward. Not in aggression, but in unwavering presence. I'm not turning this into anything, she said. I'm simply questioning how you're doing your job. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should reflect on why. Patrick opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dana had exposed something in him, something raw and unprepared for scrutiny. He had stopped her expecting compliance, but instead, she had forced him to confront himself. Dana's expression remained unreadable as she continued. It seems you've underestimated how well I understand my rights. So let me make one thing clear, I know them better than you think. Patrick's fists trembled at his sides. You think you're smarter than me, don't you? He said, his voice dropping into something darker, laced with a quiet, simmering threat. You think you can talk circles around me and walk away without consequence. Dana's lips pressed together, not in fear, but in quiet determination. No, she said simply. I don't think I'm smarter than you. But I do know this, confidence is not a crime. And respect is not a privilege, it's something every citizen deserves. Patrick took a step back, barely noticeable, but enough for Dana to recognize it for what it was, retreat. His authority, the invisible armor he wrapped himself in, was cracking. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Then, slowly, Dana raised a hand to her pocket. I'm going to take something out, she said, her voice level, deliberate. Don't worry. Patrick instinctively tensed, his fingers twitching toward his holster before he caught himself. The moment of hesitation was brief, but it was there, a flash of uncertainty, a flicker of his own prejudices betraying him. Dana withdrew a sleek black leather wallet, opening it with deliberate slowness. Then, she held it up, letting the badge inside catch the light. Patrick's face went blank, his breath stilled. Special Agent Dana Carter, she said, her voice crisp. Department of Justice. The weight of her words crashed over Patrick like a tidal wave. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his face losing a shade of its earlier color. He had spent the last several minutes trying to break someone who was, in fact, far beyond his authority. Dana let the silence hang for a beat longer before she spoke again, her tone cool and edged with something undeniable. Now, Officer Mitchell, she said. Would you like to continue this conversation? Or shall we discuss the abuse of power that just took place here in another setting? Patrick exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he took another step back, the balance of power irrevocably shifted. Dana remained standing exactly where she was, unwavering, unshaken, and utterly in control. And for the first time that night, Patrick understood, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. She pushed aside the storm of thoughts threatening to cloud her focus. Fear was an unwelcome guest in this moment. Her hands remained steady, her gaze unwavering, as though the weight of the situation could not shake her resolve. With practiced precision, she flipped open the wallet and retrieved a gleaming badge, holding it up for Patrick to see, ensuring that every detail was clear, undeniable. Dana Williams, she stated, her voice low and resolute. Chief of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Police Department. The moment the words left her lips, Patrick's world seemed to tilt off its axis. His entire demeanor shifted, his false confidence crumbling in real time. His face drained of color, leaving behind a ghostly pallor, his eyes darting frantically between the badge and the woman before him as if seeking some loophole, some way to undo what had just transpired. What? He stammered, his voice a mere whisper, stripped of the bravado it had carried mere moments ago. His gaze was frantic, searching for an escape, for some reality in which this wasn't happening. But Dana offered him no reprieve. Her expression remained as unreadable as a steel door, her authority unshaken. I oversee police conduct in this jurisdiction, Dana continued, her voice cool but weighted with the full force of her position. My job is to ensure that individuals like you, those who wear the badge and wield its power, use it responsibly and without abuse. Patrick opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by the shame that burned at the edges of his composure. His face flushed red, no longer with anger, but with embarrassment, with the dawning realization that he had just made an irreversible mistake. Dana tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing through him. You didn't know, she asked, her voice deceptively calm. Didn't know who you were dealing with. Or didn't know that your actions went far beyond the boundaries of a routine traffic stop. Patrick dropped his head slightly, his shoulders stiff, his posture resembling a man awaiting a verdict he already knew would not be in his favor. He didn't need to answer, his silence did it for him. Dana lowered the badge, but she didn't step back, she didn't need to. Her presence was an unmovable force. You may have told yourself you were just doing your job, she said, her voice cutting through the charged air like a blade. But the truth is, you let your personal biases dictate every action you took in this situation. And that is why we are standing here, not because of a traffic violation, but because of a much deeper issue. Patrick exhaled sharply, an attempt to steady himself, to reclaim some sliver of control, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled slightly, fingers curling into fists at his sides. He had spent years honing his authority, ensuring that when he spoke, people obeyed. But tonight, the very foundation of his power had been stripped away. Dana took a measured step closer, her voice unwavering. You weren't enforcing the law, she continued. You were attempting to assert dominance. But you picked the wrong person to do it with. Patrick's lip twitched, his jaw clenching tight. He wanted to fight back, to say something, anything, to reassert his authority. But what was left to say? What argument could he possibly make that wouldn't expose him further? Dana didn't wait for a response. She let the silence stretch, allowing him to feel the weight of it, to sit in the discomfort of his own actions. Then, after a long moment, she spoke again, her voice as cold as the night air around them. You think this is just about me? She asked, her eyes never leaving his. It's not. This is about every person you've pulled over and treated this way. Every person you've used your badge to intimidate. And it's about the system that has allowed you to get away with it. Patrick swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. He understood, in that moment, that this wasn't just a routine interaction gone wrong. This was something else entirely, something bigger than himself. His silence was no longer a defense, it was an admission. Dana finally took a step back, giving him space, though she never lessened the intensity of her gaze. Remember this, Officer Mitchell, she said, her voice lowering to a final, chilling warning. Your job is not to assert power. It is to serve the community. And if you can't do that, you don't deserve to wear that badge. Patrick's head dipped further, his body rigid with the weight of his own shame. He had spent years cultivating an image of strength, of control. But tonight, in the presence of Dana Williams, that image had been shattered. The next morning, as Dana walked into her office, the soft morning light streaming through the windows did little to dissipate the weight in her chest. She had faced men like Patrick Mitchell before, and she knew she would face them again. But this wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system. A deeply flawed, deeply broken system. She set her briefcase down, powered up her computer, and typed in a name, Patrick Mitchell. His profile appeared within seconds, a digital ledger of his career. Her eyes scanned the screen, absorbing the information with a growing sense of frustration. Unprofessional behavior. Abuse of authority. A history of hostility during traffic stops. She paused at a note left by a fellow officer, Mitchell. Tends to target individuals from minority groups, particularly people of color and women. Previous complaints have not been adequately addressed. Dana exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. None of this was new. Patrick Mitchell was not an anomaly. He was a symptom, and the disease ran much deeper. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to absorb the weight of what lay ahead. Then, with renewed determination, she straightened in her chair and picked up the phone. It was time to hold the system accountable. Dana sat at her desk, the quiet hum of the office doing little to ease the storm of thoughts in her mind. She reached for another file, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper as she printed out key complaints and incidents linked to Patrick Mitchell. This was no longer about a single officer. This was about a pattern, a culture that had persisted without meaningful consequences. With the documents in hand, she took a deep breath before stepping into the office of Police Chief Edward Thompson. He was a seasoned officer, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes carrying the exhaustion of years spent managing a force that often resisted change. Behind his large wooden desk, he looked up as Dana entered, noting the thick stack of papers in her grip. Dana, he greeted, his tone cautious. I heard about what happened last night. I hope it wasn't too serious. Dana didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed the stack of files on his desk, her gaze unwavering. Chief, what happened last night is just one example of a much larger issue. Thompson's brow furrowed slightly, but he gestured for her to continue. She opened the folder, sliding it toward him. This is Patrick Mitchell's file. His actions weren't a one-time mistake. This is a documented history of misconduct that we've ignored or buried. And he's not the only one. Thompson picked up the file, flipping through its pages. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern, his jaw tightening as he read. "I won't deny that there's a problem," he said finally, setting the file down. "But these things, they're complicated. You can't just—" "Chief," Dana interrupted, her tone steady but firm. "We can't afford to make excuses anymore. Officers like Mitchell aren't just damaging our department's reputation. They're eroding the trust of the community we swore to protect. If we don't act, we're complicit." Thompson exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the edge of the desk. He was weighing his words carefully, considering the implications of what she was proposing. "I'm not just asking for action against Mitchell," Dana continued. "I'm asking for a full-scale review. A deep investigation into our officers, our training methods, our accountability systems. We need to fix this from the ground up." Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You realize what you're asking, right? This won't be easy. You'll be facing pushback from within, from city officials, from people who don't want their power questioned." Dana met his gaze without hesitation. "I know. But I also know that doing nothing will cost us more in the long run. If we don't take control of this now, the consequences will be far worse." A long silence settled between them before Thompson finally nodded, his voice low but firm. "All right. I'll back you on this. But you need to be ready for the fight ahead." Dana offered a small nod, knowing this was just the beginning. Within a week, a notice was sent out to all divisions of the Sacramento Police Department. A comprehensive review was being launched, spearheaded by Internal Affairs. Officers were required to submit records, attend new training sessions, and participate in evaluations. Resistance surfaced. Immediately, senior officers shot Dana cold glances in the hallways, their silence a clear sign of their disapproval. Rumors began swirling, accusations that she was trying to dismantle the department, that she was making enemies she wouldn't be able to handle. The loudest opposition came from Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, a veteran officer with 2 decades of service. During a department meeting, Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Dana, do you really think exposing all of this to the public is a good idea? You're not fixing anything, you're just making people lose faith in us." Dana's expression didn't waver. "Mark, people don't lose faith in us because we hold officers accountable. They lose faith because we don't." A tense silence filled the room, but Dana didn't back down. "If the reputation of this department is built on ignoring misconduct, then it's not a reputation worth protecting." Outside of the department, community members were invited to forums where they could share their experiences with law enforcement. Dana sat in a crowded room as a young man stood up, his voice laced with frustration and pain. "I was pulled over for driving an expensive car. No questions, no explanations, just a full search of my vehicle because they didn't think someone like me could own it. They treated me like a criminal." A heavy silence followed. Dana, rather than defend or explain, simply met his gaze. "I'm sorry that happened to you. And I promise you, we're making sure it never happens again." Another voice rose from the back, an elderly woman, her voice trembling with emotion. "We used to trust the police. But now, we watch our children be treated like suspects just because of the color of their skin. That trust is gone." Dana swallowed the lump in her throat. "Then we need to earn it back." But words weren't enough. Dana knew real change required action. She worked with experts to overhaul officer training, focusing on implicit bias and personal accountability. During a session with new recruits, she stood before them, her voice steady. "We all have biases," she said. "But our job is to make sure they never dictate how we enforce the law. This badge isn't a shield to hide behind. It's a responsibility." Some recruits nodded, others looked unconvinced. Dana knew she wouldn't change every mind overnight. But she also knew that persistence was the only way forward. Despite her efforts, the pushback intensified. Anonymous threats landed in her inbox. A few officers resigned, blaming the hostile environment. The press caught wind of the internal strife, spinning their own narratives. But Dana remained undeterred. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, she received an email with a subject line that made her pause. "Formal review request, Patrick Mitchell." Opening it, she found an official inquiry, a sign that the wheels of accountability were finally turning. It wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was progress. Dana exhaled, glancing at the city skyline through her window. The battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she believed they were finally moving in the right direction. As various advocacy groups voiced their opinions, the reaction to Dana's efforts was mixed. Reform organizations praised her dedication to transparency and accountability, while conservative factions accused her of weakening law enforcement. The criticism didn't shake her resolve. Standing at a press conference, she addressed the concerns directly. "Our job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to build trust and protect everyone equally. If anyone believes that holding officers accountable weakens our force, then they've misunderstood our mission." Weeks of relentless effort culminated in a preliminary report that revealed glaring issues within the department: lack of oversight, ineffective complaint handling, and a culture that allowed misconduct to persist. Dana presented the findings to Chief Thompson, who remained silent as he scanned the report. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding. "We have a lot of work to do," he admitted. Dana nodded, her expression resolute. "This is only the first step, but I believe we can change." Walking out of his office, she felt the magnitude of what she had set in motion. This was no longer just about an investigation, it was a cultural shift that, if successful, could serve as a model for departments nationwide. Shortly after, an internal hearing was convened, a pivotal moment in addressing Patrick Mitchell's conduct. The goal wasn't just to determine his fate but to make it clear that abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Inside the meeting room, Patrick sat across from a panel of senior officers, investigators, and Dana. The weight of the situation was evident in the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers curled tightly on his lap. This was the moment when his unchecked behavior would finally face scrutiny. One of the lead investigators opened a file, his voice steady and authoritative. "The first complaint against Officer Mitchell was filed 3 years ago," he stated. It alleged discriminatory language during a routine traffic stop. The complaint was dismissed due to insufficient evidence, and no action was taken. More cases followed. Patterns of excessive force, hostility towards minority communities, and abuse of authority painted a damning picture. Dana remained silent throughout, her gaze fixed on Patrick, ensuring he felt the weight of every accusation. When Patrick was given the chance to speak, his usual confidence faltered. His voice was lower, almost uncertain. "I admit I've made mistakes," he muttered. "But I don't think those mistakes define my entire career. I was just doing my job, and sometimes people misunderstood my intent." Dana let the words hang in the air before responding. "Officer Mitchell, your behavior isn't an isolated issue, it's a reflection of a system that has failed to uphold accountability. These actions aren't just misunderstandings, they have real consequences. Whether or not you intended harm, the impact is undeniable. And that is what we can no longer ignore." After hours of deliberation, the verdict was announced: indefinite suspension and mandatory retraining. While it stopped short of dismissal, it sent a clear message: this was no longer a department that would turn a blind eye. But the decision sparked backlash. Veteran officers circulated a petition, claiming Dana's actions were divisive and demoralizing to the force. It spread rapidly, forcing Chief Thompson to call an emergency meeting. "We're undermining morale," one senior officer argued. "Mistakes happen, but they shouldn't lead to such severe consequences." Dana met his gaze, unshaken. "This mistake was tolerated for years. If we don't act now, our promises of fairness and transparency are meaningless." Though opposition remained, the department had reached a turning point. Patrick's case wasn't just about one officer, it was about the culture they were choosing to foster. A few weeks later, a community event was held in a large conference center. Hundreds of residents attended, elders who had lived through decades of social change, young people eager for reform. On stage, Dana stood tall, illuminated by the overhead lights, her presence commanding yet open. She began her speech with a simple, direct statement. "For too long, we've asked our community to trust us without earning that trust in return. That changes now." As she spoke, faces in the audience reflected a range of emotions: hope, skepticism, cautious optimism. But Dana knew change wouldn't be instant. It would require time, persistence, and the willingness to face resistance at every turn. This was only the beginning. She could see both determination and compassion in the faces before her. Dana stood at the podium, surveying the room, taking a brief moment to connect with the audience before speaking. The weight of the moment was heavy, but she was ready. When I stepped into this role, I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be challenges, criticism, and even resistance. But I also knew that if we didn't start somewhere, the issues we're facing would never be resolved. Her voice rang out, strong and unwavering. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her. Some were skeptical, others hopeful. In the past few weeks, the city had witnessed shocking revelations, misconduct brought to light, and an outcry for justice. But this wasn't just about a single case or one individual, it was about a broken system. This is about more than one officer or one decision, she continued. This is about a system that has allowed injustice to persist. And I am here to tell you, we will not let that continue. A round of applause erupted, voices cheering in agreement. But Dana raised a hand gently, signaling for silence. There was more to be said, more that needed to be understood. Justice isn't just about holding wrongdoers accountable. Justice is about ensuring that those entrusted with enforcing the law uphold its values with integrity, respect, and fairness, not just for some, but for everyone. She scanned the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. There were those in the crowd who had lost faith in law enforcement, those who had experienced injustice firsthand. Their pain was real, their trust broken. I know that trust in law enforcement has been shaken, she acknowledged. Some of you here have endured injustice. And I know that words alone cannot erase those wounds. But I promise you this, action will. A pause. A beat of silence filled the room as her words sank in. Then she pressed on, her tone even firmer. We have initiated reforms, not just in how we address officers who act improperly, but in how we train, oversee, and communicate with our community. This is my commitment to you. I will not stop until trust is restored. The applause came again, this time louder, more fervent. But Dana didn't stop it. She let it ripple through the hall, an affirmation that this mission was the right one. Her tone softened now, her gaze filled with determination yet warmth. We have a long road ahead. Change does not come overnight. But with determination and courage, we can build a future where everyone, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, feels safe, respected, and heard. And I promise you, I will not stop fighting for that future. As she stepped down from the podium, the crowd rose to their feet in overwhelming support. The applause was deafening, an unmistakable sign that the community was ready to stand with her. Dana smiled, but inside, her resolve only grew stronger. This was not the end, it was only the beginning. She left the hall with her head high, her eyes fixed forward. The challenges ahead would be immense, but each step brought her closer to the goal. A just system, a community built on trust, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. She knew the resistance would not disappear overnight, that change would be met with pushback. But she also knew that she was not alone. More and more voices were joining the call for justice, for reform, for real and lasting change. Dana Williams's story is not just about confronting injustice, it is about the power of taking a stand, about the courage it takes to spark change. Her fight for justice has not only led to accountability but has also planted hope for a more transparent and fair system. Now, the question turns to you. If you were in Dana's shoes, if you witnessed injustice, what would you do? Would you speak up? Would you take a stand? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Together, we can spark vital conversations and build a better society.